Hey guys, this is a video from one of our Monday training nights, just going over all of the patching there at the Rockford Worship Center. Hopefully this video is helpful for everybody. Thank you to Dave for taking it all, and check it out.
We start out with our stage patch. We have two different versions of essentially getting inputs on from the stage. The first one is a hard line from some XLR port physically on the stage. For instance, these right here are 5 through 8. I believe it's 1 through 4, 5 through 8, 9 through 12 on the 3 floor pockets in the front. So we had the first 12 in those front floor pockets, and then we start hitting wall panels. We have a total of, I believe, 1, 2, 3, 4 wall panels on right on the stage, and then there are more backstage. So this is wall panel 1. You can see WP-1. Another thing to note is that these 13 through 24 here is duplicated on this Whirlwind multi-pin port. So you can plug something in here, or you can plug in one of our big Whirlwind snakes as a multi-pin setup. And then you get all 13 through 24 through that thing. So that's one of the most confusing parts about the stage patch. If you've got a Whirlwind snake out and you plug it into channel 5 on the Whirlwind snake, you're not actually plugging it into channel 5. You're plugging it into the 15th or the 5th port on one of your wall panels. So the 5th for this one would be 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. You're actually plugging it into channel 17 on the stage. So that's one of the most confusing things that really messed with me at first, was I had to do all that math in my head of, okay, I'm plugging my Whirlwind in, but, you know. For a while, we had a consistent setup, and so what Don did was he just put label tape on the top of the Whirlwind and then rewrote the numbers on for the stage input instead. So it was like 49 was bass, 50, 51, etc. Nowadays, we really use the Whirlwind just for keys and drums, and those have moved back and forth depending on our stage setup, whether that's plugged in the front or plugged in the back. Are all of these XLR inputs on stage all converge at a place called the J panel. This is every single, all of these grays inputs is every single input from stage, as well as a couple other places. So this is where Don did the hard splits for 1 through 4, wireless 1 through 4, and 9 through 16, so that we could have it on both the main board and the secondary board.
Oh, really?
Theoretically, again, we really never have to touch that stuff, but know that all of those inputs come in here, and then all of the outputs of this J panel go to our next step, which is going to be the snakes over at the mix rack. But there are 2 master snakes coming in underneath there that get plugged into the mix rack. So one of the most confusing things about this particular setup is snake 1 goes from 1 to, I believe, 58. Then 59, 60, 61, 62, 63, and 64 on that snake are unwired. They don't do anything. And then it starts at channel 1, which is actually channel 59 over there on the J panel.
Okay.
So that's probably the most, like, it'll mess with you stuff, because if you're plugging anything in over 59 on stage, if you're plugging into any input over 59, you're suddenly going to have to subtract 58 from that number and then use that on snake 2. So if you plug into channel, let's say 78, just to make my math easy, you have to subtract 58, so you get 20. So you want channel 20 on snake 2 from 78 on stage. Wow. I know. Yep. I don't know who system designed that to leave off those last 6 channels, but it really bothers me.
Why would they even do that?
I don't know.
57 plus 1.
I don't know. And then another thing to take note of is obviously then do the math. There are about 30 channels on Snake 2 that don't go to anything. Because once we hit 96 out there, and we have 2 64 channel snakes, even though one has 6 channels missing, there's going to be a chunk that aren't doing anything. So, and you'll see it's labeled Whip 2. So that's our second snake. And then the end terminations of all of that stuff has numbers on it as well. So this looks like Whip 2 23. So I'm going to add 58 to that, which is going to be 81. So this is actually channel 81 from the stage. So this is the mix rack, the D-Live, essentially the brain of it. So these are the numbers 1 through 64 that will correspond directly with your preamp number on the console. So and it's no longer A 1 through 8, B 1 through 8, C 1 through 8. It's just a lovely 1 through 64. So the IEM and Lav board mix rack over here with all of our wireless. So all of these wireless patch directly into that mix rack, as well as a couple of them get split and sent to the J panel to drop into those hard splits. And then here you'll find the Dante cart for the IEM and Lav mix rack.
So this is a 48 port that's connected to the 112.
That's correct. This is the brain of the 112 right here.
Yep.
Yep. And then we have a Dante card in here that'll do 64 bidirectional, 64 both ways for Dante. So that's how we send any and all things from the D-Live to the mix, the IEM console, and back and forth. So we do that all over Dante. Essentially, these 48 inputs never get used on a usual Sunday morning. They only get used for events. So, first thing you'll want to take note of is this Giga Ace network port right here. This is what links the board to the mix rack. So if this thing comes unplugged, your board's going to stop responding entirely, which is why we make sure that it's a homemade, kind of flimsy old one, Cat 5e. Also, the back of the console does have 8 XLR inputs on it. If you have things that you would rather show up here. So for instance, here, if you dig far enough, is our aux jack. It technically still exists.
What?
We haven't used it for anything recently, but it is plugged into channel 7 and 8 on the back of the console.
So that's if you want to plug in your phone.
Correct.
If you have a jack on your phone. To remember to bring that.
A couple other things like our RTA mic is plugged in there, as well as our TalkBack mic is plugged in there. Outputs. We have one output coming out right now that I have no clue what it's for. Should probably look into that. I was probably just using it for some specific unique week. If we go to the I/O tab here on the D-Live, let's start with inputs, because that's kind of the direction we're coming from, the inputs tab. You'll see on our inputs here, we have an option to look at the mix rack input sockets. So mix rack local is 1 through 64 of the physical mix rack, i.e. we plug it into channel 23 on the mix rack, it's going to be channel 23 there on the mix rack local inputs. Then we talked a little bit about the DX ports on that. If you wanted to plug in like an Allen and Heath stage box, that's what DX1 and 2 and DX3 and 4 are on this tab. If you were to plug a stage box into one of those ports, that's where it would show up. Then finally, we have the 3 I/O ports that are in the mix rack. So we could plug in anything. If we had a Dante card back there, for instance, we could technically have, you know, Dante 1 through, or 128 through there. Each of these IO port cards have 128 inputs on them. So I think there's technically something like 896 possible input sources on a DLive system. It's like insane. So IO port 1, 2, and 3. And then, so most likely you're gonna be in the mix rack input sockets on local. That's the most likely scenario because that's essentially our mix rack. And you can see the majority of our inputs are selected there. The other thing to take note of that can be really kind of mess with you, it messed with me and Don for a long period of time. If we go to like the channel view here, you can see like my kick in is on 1, my kick out is on 2, 3, 4. Those are channels and they're different from inputs. You have a channel of, these are essentially your processing channels. You have 128 processing channels on the DLive, but you can assign any input to any one of those processing channels. If you look at channel, let's say 9 here, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to be coming from preamp 9 back there on the mix rack.
It just depends on how that's patched.
How this one is patched. So you can see right now, all of our drums are as one-to-one as possible. So we have the advantage of mix rack 9 is indeed going to channel 9. But if I switch that to any other input, it's still going to be channel 9.
It's basically like the old days where you had your hard plugs on the wall. What am I going to take this hard plug to get it into my console at this position, wherever
Right.
that position might be?
Exactly. So those channels, the processing channels won't ever change. It'll always be 1 through 128. But the inputs that you're sending to those can be any number of various things. The other thing to take note of is that was the mix rack. We also have an option to look at all of the surface inputs. So if we select the surface tab over here, we can switch back and forth between the mix rack and the surface. Surface local will be those physical preamps on the back of the console. So you can see that we're using 1, 2, 3, and 4 right now. Let's see where they're patched. Looks like 1 is the RTA. 2 is currently unhighlighted, which I believe means that it's patched to this guy because that's done through the talkback menu is your choice. Yeah. Oh, yeah, well, let's continue with this for a second. There's that DX5 and 6 port if you were gonna plug an Allen and Heath stage box into the back of the console. Then we have our Waves card. We have the advantage of they let us label the IO port cards. I didn't label the mix rack ones because we don't have anything in them. But you can see that we have a Waves option here. We do not currently have any inputs coming from Waves, with one exception being the electric guitars if we run through the amps. But we'll ignore that for the moment. Then we also have Dante. So this is essentially inputs from Dante that we can then assign to any of these channels. That's how we'll handle doing the channels as inserts from lavs for the dinner theater, is we'll send Dante out, Dante in, and then I can assign those Dante inputs to a channel and then send the outputs of those channels back to the IDR. You can see there's all of our like Spotify, our video channel coming from the computer, stuff like that. So we don't, yeah, all of our basically our stage inputs, which is the top of the list, is all coming from the mix rack. And then basically anything Dante related, I put down towards the end of the channel count. So.
Okay, so when you're on Surface, that's why Dante is showing up, because it's plugged
It's a
physically into the
It's a
back.
physical card in the back of the Surface, correct. Tie lines is a digital feature that DLive added in that just allows you to assign any physical input to any physical output without using any of the processing on the board or whatever. It just passes the audio. What that allows us to do is take the physical inputs on the mix rack, such as 11 and 12, which is our electric one line, and pass it directly into Waves without any processing overhead or channels or anything like that, which allows us to then throw an electric guitar amp on it. It's coming direct from stage and then send it back into the console from Waves, which is how we run that that guitar amp emulation and have it at the beginning of the chain rather than the end of the chain, which is where Waves is inserted. So we've got Waves. This was Dave's Waves session from the other day. You guys have never had to, but there is a tab here called Patch, which gives us essentially the same layout as what the DLive does, but it allows us to patch things between the DL32, which is the card in the back of this thing, and the server and back and forth, as well as giving you the option to send things to Reaper. So this is also where we do the patch for virtual sound check. So we are sending 65 through 128 from Waves into Reaper. This desktop thing is actually just Reaper, which makes sense because if we go over to our virtual sound check tab over here, we can see we have the Waves card selected and we have 65 through 128 selected as our virtual sound check channels. If we go actually into Super Rack in our overview here, we can see, for instance, if we go to drums, that we're taking channel 1 of Waves into the input of kick in right here. And then the output is going back out channel 1. So remember, there's an input 1, output 1. Those are two separate channels just going opposite directions. Which if we then go to kick in here on the console and we go to insert B, you'll see that we're sending it out Surface IO port 4, which is Waves, out channel 1 and back in channel 1 for that insert. So essentially we're sending it Waves 1 into the top of Waves 1 over here for kick in, and then the output of that goes back in as the return here, just like you would on an analog console. All right, so then the next step is Dante. You'll see we have most of our outputs assigned to something on Dante, but more importantly, if we go to our input direct outs, you'll see that we have almost all 128 channels assigned 1-to-1 on Dante. Out that Dante card. So this is how everything is going to the live stream, going to the IEM console, all that kind of stuff. We are sending the direct outputs here, which is taking it at the preamp. The direct output source point is the preamp before any of your processing, which is where we get into Dante Controller. And this is essentially just a piece of software that lets you send audio anywhere over the Dante network. You have your transmitters along the row on the top here. So anything that's sending audio into the Dante network. And then you have your receivers, which is anything receiving audio on the Dante network. Because the DLive has 128 channels both ways, it will show up as both a transmitter and a receiver. We can also see the IDR48 on here. So this is a great example. We will open up the source point of the DLive. We can see all 128 channels there. And I did my best to label them. So they're labeled kick in, kick out, snare tom, snare bottom, all that kind of thing. This corresponds to that row, right? If we open up then the receiver for the IDR48, we can see that 1-to-1 row right there. And then this is left over from a show. So ignore that little chunk down there. So this is how we take all of those instrument inputs and send them into inputs 1 through 24 over here on the IEM console. And because we did this 1-to-1 and we did this 1-to-1, it means that your channel number here, because this is taking the output of the channel, not the preamp, the channel. Now the direct output is set to the preamp, so it'll, whatever the channel's preamp is selected, it'll send that output. But if you look at channel and then look at the number, so for instance, let's take that Tom 3 again, which is 9. that should correspond to the preamp number you want over here for Dante. This should, the kick Tom 3 over here should come in 9 Dante 9 as well. I tried to make it simple on that particular one because my brain was starting to hurt by the time I got to that point. But then you can also see, if we open up the studio computer, we've got 1 through, 38 patched to the studio as well, 1 to 1. So that is how we're getting all of those direct outputs after the preamp into the studio back there.
And that's the cool thing that points out, is that you have this sending unit, which is the D-Live, and then all of these receivers can, I mean, you duplicate all those. It's not like, oh, it can only be down here on the IDR 48.
Right.
No, I can also send it out to the studio.
Right.
And oh, I can also send it out to Reaper. And oh, I can also send it whatever.
It's like having an infinite number of splitters
Yeah,
that you
right.
can send it
It's
to.
like a splitter.
Exactly.
That's like,
That's pretty cool. That's pretty cool.
never even wrote.
If you ever open up Dante Controller, which post today I have put the icon on the desktop, so if you ever need to see anything, for the most part, hopefully you never have to touch this because it's taken care of by the time we hit Sunday mornings. But the one thing you want to be looking for is any of these red circles. What that essentially means is that a channel assignment, an input to an output on Dante has not connected. Something has not gone right. This orange triangle means that source doesn't exist currently. So, i.e. something hasn't been plugged into the Dante network. So the D-Live, for instance, that's pretty common. We had a USB port that was running Zoom at one point, a USB to Dante adapter. So we had Zoom patched into the D-Live here. Well, now that Zoom or that USB adapter or whatever is just sitting on the shelf. So it's not existing on the Dante network to patch in here. The only one that we're okay with seeing is the one on VIA. If any of the other ones have this particular symbol, something's gone wrong. The only reason we're okay with seeing it on VIA is because VIA is a custom piece of software that sits on a computer and allows programs to enter the Dante network. So you can have specific Dante inputs for something like Spotify or something like Zoom or something like it operates as a physical or as a bridge there. And what that red circle means on VIA means that Jake doesn't have that particular program open on that computer right now. So that source is dead. So we don't need to worry about those right there on VIA, but if you see it on any other ones, it's an issue. The other thing we might need to look at, so it's called clock status. All of these should be green. And what that means is that they are all locked into the same clock. It's what sends to obviously all of those ports up on stage, so that if you plug into anything into one of those Dante ports up there, it'll pop up here on Dante Controller. Is this row up here? We recently did an overhaul of our Dante network switches. And what these are, if you look really closely in the back, you can actually see the network switch behind it. But these are just 8 PoE Dante ports that I've put out here on the front panel through EtherCon jacks. This will become especially important if we use Dante stage boxes in the future. This is where they will plug in.
I hope this was helpful for you guys. Feel free to reach out if you ever have any questions. Thank you for what you do.